We have a new episode of Legends and Leaders, and today it's great to have Matt here. So, Matt, you're the co-founder and CEO of RSE Ventures, one of the predominant ventures in the U.S. and the world. You've helped start so many different interesting companies that have disrupted food and entertainment and sports. You've held leadership positions in the Jets and the Dolphins, and helped build out the stadium that's used today by the Jets. And you really tried to transform and been impactful in so many people's lives, and that's why you received the Ellis Island Medal of Honor. So, definitely great to have you here, and I'm looking forward into getting to your story.
All right, thanks for having me. Appreciate the
Awesome.
introduction. Although, as you're saying all that, I'm like, I didn't really do a lot of that stuff.
So, where did this kind of passion for business leadership and entrepreneurship come from? Did you have it as a kid? Like, how did it begin?
Yeah, I do think I had it as a kid, although a little bit of hindsight bias as you start reconstructing your own journey. So caveat that. But if you take a step back, my entire life has had to have been architected from scratch. There really wasn't a template for what I dealt with and where the path I chose. So I grew up in extreme poverty as a kid in Queens and taking
Mm.
care of a progressively more disabled mother. And when I was very young, I made this radical decision to basically accelerate my way out of poverty by getting to college as fast as possible. And there was a hack that if you were to drop out of high school and you actually did well enough on your GD, you could start college and get a better paying job, which is what I did. And we can get into the details of that move, but that was the beginning of my whole burn the boats philosophy of putting yourself in situations where you don't exactly have it all figured out, but you trust your instincts. And so when I'm looking back at my entire journey, that's very entrepreneurial, right? I had to defy conventional wisdom. My guidance counselor and everyone else said I was going to be a loser and condemned to work at McDonald's for the rest of my life. And I had to really take the uncertain path. Most importantly, I saw something that to me
Mhm.
made complete sense. My mother is sick and will eventually succumb to her illness, which she did. I felt very convicted that I was running out of time. I hated my life and I saw another way. And to me, it was so clear, obvious, and yet everyone else did. So I would go to bed excited, like, oh, high school's actually stupid. I don't need trigonometry. I don't even know what it is, but I can go ahead and get a better paying job. So it's a long way of saying, like, when you're a true entrepreneur, you'll see evidence all around you and how you live your life, how you relate to the world, that are the seeds of ultimately being an entrepreneur in a business context, but they first show up in your personal life.
Mhm. So, what were your first steps after graduating college? Like, how did you get into the business world?
Yeah, I mean, I graduated college. I mean, again, not a typical progression. So I went to college for 7 years a night, doing two jobs in a day.
Mhm.
So it's not like my working career started when I finished college. It started before I started college. So by the time I graduated, I went from being a 16-year-old high school dropout to being, by the time I was 26, the press secretary of the mayor of New York. And I was the youngest press secretary at the time, maybe still. But I went from making 375, $5 an hour to $100,000 a year in a decade, which is pretty great CAGR if you were to compound that. But it became like a race. I feel like I had tapped into the codes of the universe that if you, again, keep doing this burn the boats move, put yourself in situations where you don't have it figured out, deal with the anxiety of feeling like you're an imposter or out of your depth, and trust your ability to perform under pressure. The clarity of crisis decision making actually enabled me to accelerate my complete trajectory. So I graduated from school after 7 years. I go to law school at night at Fordham Law. And by the time I was approaching my last year of Fordham, I was named press secretary.
Mhm. So, I think you were press secretary at one of the most difficult times in New York, in history. How did you kind of manage and handle that role? I mean, it was a great amount of responsibility during the whole the towers collapse, etc.
Yeah, it was an extraordinary moment. A lot of it honestly still feels inaccessible to me mentally because you're seeing such horrific things. I was standing underneath the tower and the sounds of people jumping still is in my head, right? Like kind of feels like I can't completely access it. But the way I dealt with it was we all have terrible things that happen to us that eventually become our strengths. And for me, the terrible thing was this unrelenting feeling of being under crisis and feeling desperate and constantly under the state of hypervigilance. Uh, and then it became a little bit of a superpower. So when the world literally did go to hell,
Mhm.
I was more peaceful. I felt like I was in the right time, right place. And so for me, honestly, being on the ground at 9/11 felt like where I belong. And then rather than leave, which a lot of my colleagues did, they left government at the end of the mayor's administration
Mhm.
in January of 2002, I decided to stay. I relocated my apartment to the perimeter of Ground Zero, and I became
Wow.
one of the first employees of the agency charged with rebuilding the Trade Center. I felt like, oh, this is the consolation prize of trauma, is that I'm well equipped to deal with ambiguity and suffering. So I'd say to anyone out there who is going through something torturous, remember that something's also being created at the same time, which is a capacity to deal with unrelenting pressure and actually perhaps to lower your blood pressure when other people raise their blood pressure. So I developed a reputation for a person who can handle it. And I was one of the first employees of rebuilding. I moved there. I spent 2 years of my life helping organize the largest competition in the history of the world to create the memorial and vision for redeveloping the site.
Mhm. How did you determine like what should be built there? Like what was appropriate to be built at such an important place?
Yeah, I mean, I was chief operating officer, so there were a lot of people involved. I was one, cog in the machine, but the principles were you have to commemorate those who were lost. This is unique in that it's not the site for. If you look at the Vietnam Memorial, right? It's in the park in D.C. on the Mall. It's not where the Vietnam War took place. Obviously, this is where a war on terrorism began, and so there are
Mhm.
people who never reclaimed their loved ones. So it had to serve many different purposes. The actual final resting place for unknown remains, a place of commemoration and reflection. It also had to serve as a place of resurrection, of redemption and resilience, where we demonstrated that we were not defeated. So it had to reconcile all these competing pressures on 16 acres. And so the long and the short was bringing together all the different voices, making sure nobody drowned anybody else out. When you're in such an emotionally loaded situation, part of your job when you're presiding over it, one is to be universally disliked because you're not going to make anybody happy.
Mhm.
But two is also to try to counterbalance so that no voice is eclipsed unfairly. And so we had to reconcile the residents of Lower Manhattan, family members who wanted a memorial, commercial interests who wanted to rebuild the city, people who just wanted revenge. I mean, it was a lot of impulses. So there's no short answer other than looking back. I think the site speaks for itself. I think it's probably one of
Mhm.
the most powerful memorial. My personal objective, I didn't have children at the time, I do now, was that I wanted to bring my future children to the site. And without explaining to them, I wanted them to be able to process the enormity of the loss and also to care. When we went around the world and looked at different memorials, the ones that did not stand the test of time, we determined, were very literal memorials that were meant to memorialize only those people who died, only the 3,000 people at the World Trade Center. And what happens is when a couple of generations are removed, it's too remote, too abstract. The site, because it's literally 1 acre voids that
Mhm.
recede into the water with the water. And underneath one of the footprints is the unidentified remains. Even my little boy can go there and be like, "Oh my God, Dad, there was a 1 acre building here, and all those people died." And so I'm very proud, more than anything else I was involved with around that my child can go to that site and process the magnitude of the horror.
Mhm. So what were you thinking of getting into after that? I mean, that was a very much intense role. There was a lot of emotion involved in what you were building there. Like, what did you kind of think? I think you wanted to go into sports, and you got involved with the Jets after that. Like, how did you kind of foray into the next thing?
Yeah, I mean, the tough part, anyone out there who's experienced a degree of trauma, unrelenting trauma in particular, we call it PTSD, but to not get clinical on it, like you do sort of become addicted to the adrenaline, and that becomes a terrible way to live your life. And I
Mm.
really wanted to transition to something at least a little heated, hard, but maybe not with such great stakes, not
Mhm.
truly life or death. And so I went to the New York Jets to oversee the rebuild, their quest for a stadium. And of course, I thought it was going to be all, peaceful, but we ended up with a terrible war with the owner of Madison Square Garden, spent hundreds of millions of dollars fighting each other to try to build a stadium on the West Side. And we ultimately went and shared a new stadium with the New York Giants. So really important lesson for anyone listening. We tend to subconsciously put ourselves in our own box, and we blame others. We blame other people for hampering our potential or for typecasting us. But in reality, it's the voice in our head that's preemptively anticipating judgment of others and then reacting to it. I know that's like a big sentence to swallow, but we imagine if we take this one step and reinvent ourselves, we're going to be met with rejection. And then we censor ourselves and we give other people agency. Why that's so important in my context. When I was in government, it would have been easy to conclude that, well, I'm a government worker now. I'm a
Mhm.
PR person, two things I didn't want to be for the rest of my life. I was happy with that. And so when you zoom out, and you define your skills as broadly as possible, you have permission to use those skills in different contexts. My fundamental skill was to act within a crisis environment, within a public-private partnership, to manage competing constituencies that don't agree, and be able to shepherd a really hard project to fruition. That worked just as well in a government as it did in a sports team. And the second most important principle, you want to leverage your assets to move you closer to what you want to be doing and further away from what you don't, right? I didn't want to spend my whole life in government. I didn't want to spend my whole life as an adrenaline junkie. I did want to become an entrepreneur. And the path to that seemed like it ran through the New York Jets. And so I leveraged the skill set to get the job running a sports team, but it was never, ever meant to be my final destination.
Mm-hmm. And how similar would you say being an executive in a sports team was to going and having this entrepreneurial life and running your own business? Like, do you think there's a lot of similarities between those, or is it vastly different because there's more risk associated with you and as you're running the business?
Great question. Vastly different. And so part of the anxiety I started having, feeling I'd been doing the job at the Jets for 8 years, which was an incredible honor. And the owner of the team, Woody Johnson, gave me a ton of responsibility, and Jay Cross was the president at the time. And so all this great responsibility, but it was very heady. And when you have a very heady job with a big brand, you work at Apple, you work at Google, you work at Amazon, it actually becomes a prison of your own making. Your ego does, because you're worried that people won't respect you the same. You know, you're worried that you won't get the reservation, like stupid, shallow shit, and actually really important stuff. Like, you're just not going to be as well compensated out there in the real world without the heft of the brand. So when I was working for the Jets, that was my fear. I was like, oh, and then I was like, wait, but this is everyone else's dream job, but mine. I never dreamed of sitting on the 50-yard line and running a sports team. I mean, I like sports, but like, they're fine to stay on Sunday, not Monday for me. And yet here I am in this context. And I'm like, no, what I loved about the team was the complexity of building a stadium. What I don't love about running a big organization is the maturity of the brand, right? And it's just not interesting to me. And so I had to think long and hard, like, okay, everyone else values this job. We kill you for it, literally. And yet it's not what you value most about life. What you value most is the construction, is the pain and suffering of being alone and being on the bleeding edge and trying to push something into existence. If you don't leave soon, you're never going to be able to leave, because the money will become golden handcuffs. And I made a lot at the team, made me a millionaire, to be honest. And so that was one of not the hardest decisions. It was one of the most counterintuitive decisions where, again, I had to burn the boats. I decided to leave without another opportunity. And I knew the world was open to me if I opened myself up to the world, but I left without the future secured, because I was beginning to live my life according to the prestige. And I would say to anyone, be careful when you find yourself in a situation, because then you look back and you're like, this is not my beautiful house. This is not my beautiful car, as the song goes.
So how did you start your own venture? Like, how did that begin?
Yeah. So again, back to leverageable assets. Steve Ross is the owner of the Miami Dolphins. He's known as one of the largest developers in the United States, the most successful. But the truth of the man is he's like a 20-year-old and now in an 80-year-old man's body. Like, he is the most creative human being I've ever been around, and the most open-minded and flexible and dynamic. He was running the team. The Dolphins at the time were experiencing blackouts. The games wouldn't even show up on TV. It was considered one of the hardest markets, believe it or not. It sounds so crazy fast forward a decade later. And he needed help turning the team around. And he had known me because we sat next to each other. And he made me a proposal. We started working on it. He knew my dream was to create companies, to back entrepreneurs, to really be creative. And his need was to turn the team around. And so the need and the dream converged. And I said, I'll oversee the team. I ended up serving as the interim CEO for a period of time. I'll help you build a world-class management team. But what I really want to do is leverage this incredible calling card to back consumer businesses. When you own a sports team of any caliber, it is the most amazing calling card and magnet for deal flow. And yet teams tend to behave very monopolistically, leagues especially. It's called, protect the shield, protect the brand. It actually inhibits risk taking. And two, it doesn't always attract the most talented people, because there's a million people who want that job. Because there's a million people who want that job, they don't have to pay equity. They don't have to pay big bonuses. And that also tends to attract a certain kind of person, right? So, the ones who really want to make all the money go to Goldman, and they enjoy it on a Sunday. And so that's a long way of saying the need and the dream converge, because Steve is always about how to leverage what he's doing to build bigger, to do things differently, fearlessly. And we began to build RSE. And Now it looks very tidy, or sort of, you're in these different verticals. But the truth of the matter is, it was a very loose premise to back great founders, to bring innovation to the fore, to leverage the team to the extent possible. And now the rest is a lot of hindsight bias. It's like
Yeah.
this is the verticals we play in, but that's mostly bullshit.
So how did you like begin your first investment, raise the capital? Was that just Steve kind of put that in? How did that get started?
Yeah, it's always been a partnership between the two of us. And the version 1.0 of RSE was a combination of opportunities that I had been incubating in my mind and opportunities that were born by those opportunities. And so
Mm.
to make that less abstract, Gary Vaynerchuk, when I was at the Jets, I met Gary, who was a crazy Jets fan. And I had given him, I think it was 8 Jets tickets that he still sits in to this day in
Huh.
order to launch the firm. He sat down with me at a bagel store and he's like, me and my brother AJ, he was 12 at the time, whatever. He's like, we have a vision for the world. All these big consumer companies like J&J and Procter and Gamble, they're not going to be able to handle social media because they're like battleship carriers. We're going to build a speedboat and they're going to
Mm.
outsource their social to us and they're never going to be able to keep up, which by the way, how prophetic. This is 2009. He's like, they're never going to pick up, whether it's Twitter today, Facebook yesterday. He didn't say TikTok because he didn't know about it yet, but you know what I mean? Similar, like they're never going to keep up. We're going to create a new version of an advertising firm built at
Mm.
social media first. I give him those 8 Jets tickets. When I partner with Steve, I tell him about Gary. We bring in Gary. He totally gets it in like 10 seconds. We end up becoming the minority partner and the only partner in Vayner Media. Fast forward, largest social media firm in the planet, with
Wow.
offices all over. So that's an example of what I did in version 1.0 was a combination of those ideas and then also building from scratch. We helped incubate with Gary and Ben Leventhal, Resy, the restaurant reservation
Mhm.
platform. A lot of like incubating. We built the International Champions Cup, our big soccer tournament. And then as time goes by, anyone who's tried to incubate at scale knows like you're going to fail miserably or die. It's too painful. And so we started writing larger and larger checks that in some way pressed an advantage. And so, for example, we have a very significant food portfolio where the real estate expertise is an asset where you can help founders who are looking to
Mm.
scale not screw up their real estate division. And that's how we partnered with David Chang and Momofuku.
Mhm. How did the Resy acquisition by American Express happen?
So Ben is an amazing founder, comes up with this idea. And then sometimes in life, when you're sitting on an asset, you have to say, okay, am I the best one to optimize this asset? Or
Mm.
could this asset be supercharged in someone else's hands? Because I don't believe in blind buy and hold logic. I think that's actually naive. Now, Steve has taught me that more often than not, that is the right bias to have. And, when you're young, you're like, let's sell this, let's do that. And he would always say, don't be a grasshopper. And I'm like, what the hell does that mean? Like, and now with the benefit of hindsight and time, it is really true. You're better served by having a bias to hold things because when it's very hard to find winners, you want to press the winners. That being said,
Mm.
caveat, when you have an asset, you have to always ask yourself, could this asset be better deployed in someone else's hands? Can I take advantage of that as being their partner and like ride along? Or should I exit? How big can I really make this? And that was the perfect scenario with Resy. We had started with this on the premise that we were going to enable restaurants to flex up and sell reservation slots, which is a clever idea, but not a big market. We stumbled upon, Ben did, this point of restaurants really need help in optimizing the yield of their table configurations, and the back end of Open Table at the time sucked. And so he's like, let's create a
Mm.
really dynamic back end and create a SaaS product. Great. Now, a customer acquisition when you're dealing with restaurants that don't open till 3 in the afternoon, and you
Yeah.
know what I mean, and the margins are terrible in the restaurant industry, like really hard. So, but here's what we did do: the restaurants that didn't need to be on Open Table were the ones that control their own demand. They didn't have to go ahead and worry about Open Table buying SEO ads optimized and intercepting their demand for the random Chinese food restaurant. They had their own brand. But what they did need was the service that Ben was offering. And so what happened is what began as one idea morphed into another, and then the asset that was created was the aggregation of the best restaurants in the country, ultimately the world. That aggregation was better used by Amex than by us. Amex could take that and turn that into a customer benefit for Gen Z. So
Mm.
I would say to anybody out there who's a founder, like, don't be seduced into this idea of like, I got to buy, I got to hold, or there's some shame in selling. Like, if you conclude that your baby will grow up better and healthier in someone else's hands, then do it. Like, people say, oh, do you regret, that Ben and you and Gary, like we sold Red? I'm like, not for a second, because I love what Amex has done with it. And I don't care if Amex turned it into $1 billion asset. Good for them. And so that's always been my view. That's a long way of answering your question.
Yeah. So with Milk Bar, like what did you see in Milk Bar early on that made you want to be involved in that and fund it, et cetera?
Yeah, I think like if you read when you read my book Burn the Boats, and anybody out there who's read it, first of all, thank you. You know exactly what I'm talking about. I spent a lot of time meditating on what the Italians call, and I won't ruin it by saying it in Italian, but the fish rots from the head. Basically, that the problems and opportunities of any business, said another way, it's all about the jockey. There's a million cliches to capture a very real phenomenon, that it really does begin with the founder. And so we tend to be very founder driven in our investing. Christina Tosi is incredibly delightful, wonderful human being, this, great whimsical product. And we just saw an opportunity to scale it. And that we've been on this journey together for, I think, since 2017. Opened up a bunch of stores, then launched at retail, and we're still on this journey. But it all began with this magical person with a degree in mathematics who is the top baker in America.
Yeah. How would you say like your experience on Shark Tank has affected your ability to make deals? Like, have you thought about deals differently, how they're structured, who to be able to invest in, things like that? Like, has it affected that at all?
The honest answer is no.
Mm.
It was an amazing experience to be on Shark Tank. The impact of Shark Tank was exactly what I hoped it would be,
Mhm.
which is it's a proxy for anointing you as a great investor. And
Yeah.
it also provides a great clip for people to show people like, this is how I behave under pressure, right? Like what I
Right.
love about being on the show, people who know me only through the show, as much as I was only on, whatever, 6 episodes, like 2 seasons, they know actually a lot about me. And I remember Kevin
Mm.
O'Leary said to me, don't try to be a caricature of yourself or an amalgam of all of us. Be yourself because the camera doesn't lie. And I thought that was like at first simplistic, naive advice. And then I was like, oh, it's actually very true. One, you'll perform better, but two, you're going to be who you're going to be. And so there was a great episode on Shark Tank when there was a woman who her name is Sarah. She owns a business called Supergirl, right? And it's vegan soup, heavy protein, you know, great. They come onto Shark Tank, and I'm watching this mom and daughter duo, and they're pitching, and I'm like, oh, they're so nice. And then they all get torn apart by
Oh
in
my.
different ways. Lori's tearing apart is very gentle. Mark Cuban's is slightly imperial. Kevin is like, ruthless. Robert, you don't even know that he tore you apart. He's so nice. Like, but anyway, like my point is, they were ripped apart. And I remember Kevin O'Leary telling them that you are going to go bankrupt. And I was sitting there thinking, and you're trying to get your own, like you're sitting on set, you don't want to challenge, it's like you're invited to somebody else's house. So you're trying to be diplomatic. But I remember sitting there thinking, like, how are you, first of all, what the hell do you know about this business that's been pitching you for 30 minutes? But more importantly, I can't remember as he's talking, but thinking, objects in motion tend to stay in motion. Objects in motion tend to stay in motion. Businesses that have crossed the threshold of being alive for 5, 6, 7 years, there's actually data around this, but they are way more likely to be around 5 years from now than a business that hasn't been around 5 years. Master of
Huh.
the obvious. So I remember he was telling him that, and then I jumped in. I'm like, how do you know that she's going to go? I was like, I don't think. And then he was yelling, don't encourage her. She's going to go bankrupt. And this was one of the hardest moments because I was like, I actually don't want to invest. I don't think it's an investable business for me. I can't get a venture return, but that's different than saying it's not good for Sarah and her mom. That's a great business. That's a delightful product that should exist, right? So long story short, I passed. They ripped me apart for giving them encouragement. I ended up forming a bond with them after the show because I was so drawn. We became friends. We became advisors. And then most recently, I became an investor because I was
Wow.
like, and so the point for me on Shark Tank is more, it was a little bit of a microcosm about how I behave. And then similar to a sports team, having been a shark on Shark Tank is an incredible imprimatur that helps you with deal flow and helps people take you seriously in different contexts. If I'm being perfectly honest.
Just the last question that I have, Matt. So, you guys were ranked as one of the best companies to work for in the sports area in the world. What do you think has went into the company culture that you've created that has put you guys in that type of position to get recognized for being this great place to work at?
No, thank you. And again, anyone who wants to sort of tell apart the secret sauce, I'd go deep into and burn the boats of 50 different case studies of investments that I have done. And the whole premise of the book is to try to explain to people what commitment really looks like. We are taught as young people, like backup plans are prudent, right? We're all walker. It's prudent to have a plan B. And actually what science and history shows, and there's great studies in my book, that we conjure a backup plan. We tell ourselves we do it because it's prudent and it's safe. We actually do it to alleviate the psychological pain of wanting something so bad that it hurts. So in writing my book, I wanted to do something that I think a lot of successful people don't do, is to show in real time the crap that I have to overcome just to function. I don't put it in the rear view mirror. I talk about how when I was on Shark Tank, I had imposter syndrome and it was embarrassing. And it took a lot to share that story because I was like, oh,
Yeah.
I look pretty good on TV. But I was like, it's a disservice. Who cares that I look good on TV? Let me tell people how crappy I was beforehand. So that's a long way of saying I believe that the company we built and the culture we built is to attempt to be honest about the pain and agony of building a company and being an entrepreneur, and not stare at the spreadsheet, not try to reduce everything to numbers, to really focus on the psychology of creation and create a lot of space to allow that to be discussed. The book creates space. If you're an entrepreneur and you read my book, you're like, wow, you're talking openly about having one testicle and divorce. You know what I mean? Like, there's things I would prefer not to talk about, but it's modeling. So long way of saying, I think we've created a culture at RSE that takes founders as they come, is not afraid of idiosyncrasy, and is not afraid of iterating our way out from disaster to a better place. I have certain disasters and things I've invested in that have made me shake like a rabbit in the middle of the night, like, oh my God, this is such a, and yet I look back, I'm like, man, I can't believe we figured that out. Like every day I have like, damn, I can't believe we figured that out. And I'm like, I can't believe I doubted we were going to figure it out, even though I know that we're going to figure it out. And I even wrote a book about how you figure it out. I still didn't believe it. And so that's, I think, the culture we've created. And people, look, everyone has haters, but I think a lot of people who we interacted with say, damn, they were very flexible. And I'll give you a last point. We don't have any exit provisions in any of our investments. Not a single deal that we do have mandatory exit provisions. There's no 5 to 7 year, because my view is like, you'll let me know when you're ready to sell. If the founder is defeated because they're exhausted and it's not viable to have a professionalized CEO, they're going to sell the business. And so Steve and I are not a fund. We are a partnership. And the business is a manifestation of our ethos and what we've done. We are not the same. He is way more successful than I will ever be financially, but it really is an expression of how we approach the world. And I think that's what emanates from our culture.
Well, yeah, I agree, Matt. I think I think you've done something really special with RSE, and you continue to help a lot of different entrepreneurs throughout the world, and really make an impact in this space, and change the faces of many different industries. So I wish you much success with what you're going to do next, and people should definitely check out your book, the Burn the Boats book. I think you have a lot of great lessons you discussed here and there, and I hope that they would enjoy reading that too.
Thank you. And my last word to anybody, I'm on a mission with this book, and I'm on a mission to hold up a mirror to what you already suspect you're capable of, but maybe don't feel supported in your life. The book is meant to be your mentor and your friend. And so if you read the book and it changes you, DM me. I read every single one of them. And what it does when you DM me, you make me continue for one more day. And so then someone else is reached. And I know that sounds a little bit, Pollyannish, but it's true. It's very hard to keep pushing a book, and by you letting me know. So if it has an impact, please DM me. Awesome. And thank you. It's great to talk to you.